Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Juta Padakamalam Sri Gurun. Mantra Guru Ajotushigu Guru Gon Ta Charane Agi Koriya Bandhan Bandeyaham Sri Guru Shijita Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavang Shri Rupam Sagada Chatam Sahaganuraganatam Mitam Tang Shajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijanashaitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shivishakam Gitam Shcha Om Agyana Timananda Shagyanan Janasholakaya Chukshu Unvalitam Yana Tasma Sri Gurave Namaha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutalasham Hare Bhakti Vedanta Swami Iti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gaudavani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shannavari Prashtatade Shatarine. Welcome to Lesson 6 of the Nectar of Devotion Bhakti Shastri study. In our previous lesson, lesson number 5, we studied chapters 3 and chapters 5 of the Nectar of Devotion by Srila Prabhupada. We explained the eligibility for accepting, practicing and advancing in Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti as described by Srila Rupa Goswami. We explained the independent nature of pure devotional service in chapter 5, and we discussed ISKCON's practice of claiming members from all sections of Western countries in relation to the principles established by Srila Rupa Goswami, evidences given by Srila Sanatana Goswami, and we discussed the relevance of that for the spreading of Krishna consciousness all over the world. So today in lesson 6 we're going to be studying chapters 6 to 8. In chapter 6, Prabhupada began how to discharge devotional service. Srila Prabhupada, he actually lists the Rupa Goswami, following the flow of Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Srila Prabhupada lists the 64 items, Choishati Sadhananga, the 64 items of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, and subsequent chapters from, we can take a look at this diagram, we're taking a look at the slide actually, 64 items. From chapter 6, where we are now, to chapter 13, Srila Prabhupada will enumerate elaborately and give a detailed explanation on these 64 items which are enumerated by Srila Rupa Goswami, and we will cover this material over 3 lessons. So we'll be covering today chapters 6 to 8, how to discharge devotional service, evidence regarding devotional principles and offences to be avoided. The following chart can help us understand the different categories which comprise of the 64 items, Choishati Sadhananga. So the first 20 items, which we'll be discussing in detail shortly, the first 20 items are described as the primary items. The first 10 items Prabhupada describes as being the activities which we must do, pravriti, and items 11 to 20 are items that we must avoid. And Prabhupada mentions that these 20 items are essential in the practice of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. Subsequent to that, there's 44 additional items, items of sadhana, which we will discuss in detail, 21 to 59. And then again, the Panchanga Bhakti, the 5 most important items of the 64 items, they're also discussed separately. And Prabhupada discusses all of this from chapter 6 to chapter 13 of the Nectar of Devotion, and we will discuss this in detail as we go through. So let's begin our analysis and our study of the first 20 items, and that begins on chapter 7. So we can go through some of these points and discuss them. Regarding accepting the shelter of the bona fide spiritual master as Guru Padasrai, Prabhupada explains that First of all, he's explaining the qualifications of the bona fide spiritual master, quoting from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Tasmat Gurun Prapadyesha Jigyasha Shreya Uttam, that the spiritual master must have realized the conclusions of the scriptures by deliberation and argument, and thus be able to convince others of the conclusions, and has taken full shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Prabhupada comments a little later in his summary that to accept a spiritual master is the crucial point for a spiritual advancement. And one should accept initiation from the spiritual master. Prabhupada's commenting in a very formal way. That's this Guru Padasraya Dikha, the second item of the 64 items. One should learn Srimad Bhagavatam seriously, with all respect and veneration, from the spiritual master. The attitude of the disciple should be to satisfy the bona fide spiritual master. Then it will be very easy for him to understand spiritual knowledge. Regarding the first 20 items, Srila Prabhupada comments, without following the above-mentioned 10 principles, one cannot properly elevate himself to the platform of sadhana bhakti, or devotional service in practice. Altogether, Srila Rupa Goswami mentions 20 items, and all of them are very important. Out of the 20, the first 3, namely accepting the shelter of a bona fide spiritual master, taking initiation from him, and serving him with respect and reverence, are the most important. Let's examine in more detail these very important first 20 items of the 64 items of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. Prabhupada begins his explanation and analysis of these first 20 items. In fact, chapter 7 is pretty much an analysis and explanation of these first 20 items. So let's examine chapter 7 in more detail, beginning with evidence regarding with devotional principles. And let's begin with Srila Prabhupada's comments on the importance of accepting the shelter of the bona fide spiritual master, the Guru Padasraya. Prabhupada first of all gives the qualifications of the bona fide spiritual master. He must have realized the conclusion of the scriptures by deliberation and argument, and be able to convince others. Jai Krishna Tattaveta, Shai Guru Hoy, Mahaprabhu explains. And such great personalities who've taken full shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, living aside all material considerations. So liberated souls. Also, as the Upanishads explain, that Tasmat Gurum Prapadyetam Jigyasham Shreya Uttam Samat Panishrotavyam Brahmanishtam, that the bona fide spiritual master is one who's learned in the conclusions of the Sampradaya Siddhanta, Srutriyam and Brahmanishtam. He's firmly established in the Brahman. Further down the page, Prabhupada comments that such a qualified spiritual master has conquered the influence of the 6 sense gratificatory agents, the tongue, the genital, the belly, anger, mind, and the words. Anyone who has practiced controlling these 6 is permitted to make disciples all over the world. Prabhupada paraphrasing Srila Rupa Goswami's Upadesh Amrita, the first verse, Vachavegam, Manasakroda Vegam, Jiva Vegam, Udurupashta Vegam, Etan Vegan, Yo Vishaheta Dira. Those who Etan Vegan, those who can tolerate the pushings of the tongue, the mind, the belly, the genitals, pushings of anger, the speech. Etan Vegan, Yo Vishaheta Dira. Etan Vegan, one who can tolerate these urges, Yo Vishaheta Dira, and remain sober. Sarvam apimam prithivi shashishat. All over the world he can accept disciples. Prabhupada comments that to accept such a spiritual master who's fully conversant in the shastric conclusions of the Sampradaya, and who has conquered, who's able to tolerate, who's not disturbed by the pushings of the senses and the mind. So to accept such a spiritual master, not disturbed by the pushings of the senses and the mind as a result of being completely absorbed in the devotional service of Sri Hari with the mind and senses. To accept such a spiritual master is a crucial point for advancement in spiritual life. just on that point, actually, we'll see that these descriptions of the qualifications of the spiritual master here, they are describing the bhakta that may be on the level of Vaidhi sadhana bhakti, not necessarily bhav or prem bhakta, to function as the spiritual master according to these qualifications, because they've realized the conclusions of the scriptures. That's first class Vaidhi sadhana standard. That's actually the qualification, high eligibility for practicing Vaidhi sadhana. That they are conversant in Krishna Tattva, Jai Krishna Tattva Veta, Shri Guru Hoy. And so that's all aspects of sadhana. And able to convince others, that's also sadhana, that's preaching, Krishna consciousness, that's an item of sadhana. And Sravanam Kirtanam, so that's sadhana, expert in sadhana, having taken shelter of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's the first item of sadhana, Guru Padasrai. So we can see that one on the level of Vaidhi sadhaka can effectively function as a spiritual master according to the definition of the spiritual master. Conquered the influence of the 6 gratifying agents. That's also done through practice of Vaidhi sadhana bhakti. So to accept such a spiritual master is a crucial point for advancement in spiritual life. One should accept initiation, Guru Padasraya Dikha, accepting initiation and receiving instructions from him. Prabhupada explains that one should accept the spiritual master as God, because he's the external manifestation of Krishna. Prabhupada's again quoting from the Srimad Bhagavad Acharyam Vijaniyam Navamanyata Kahichit, that one should understand the spiritual master to be me, non-different from me, Krishna. And one should learn the Srimad Bhagavatam seriously with all respect and veneration for the spiritual master. We can see how wonderfully Srila Prabhupada has fulfilled his responsibility as the spiritual master in training disciples by providing for them the Granth Srimad Bhagavatam with the Bhaktivedanta purports, so that every disciple and subsequently every follower of Srila Prabhupada can very intimately associate with him by absorbing themselves in hearing Srila Prabhupada's writings and his shared realizations in the Srimad Bhagavatam purports. So in that way, so in such a wonderful way, Srila Prabhupada has facilitated his disciples and every subsequent follower of his divine grace to be able to, with great respect and veneration for the spiritual master, study Srimad Bhagavatam, just by studying Srila Prabhupada's Srimad Bhagavatam and purports and worshipping Srila Prabhupada. So that's, and accepting initiation. One should accept initiation according to the Vaishnav Tantra, the process of, as we'll be discussing, as we discussed actually yesterday, that Yatha Diksha Vidhanena. This is what's being referred to here, this Diksha process where one receives mantra from the spiritual master. Actually the five different Pancha Sanskar, 5 different aspects of Diksha, which in ISKCON we also provide through the first and second initiation, which include the Harinam, receiving a name of Sri Hari, and Pondra, wearing the tilak of Lord Vishnu, and Yaja and Mantra, receiving the mantra, the different Vaishnav mantras that we have, as it describes that Mahaprabhu received a Dash Akar, a 10-syllable Vaishnav mantra from Srila Ishwar Puri Prabhupada when he took initiation. So one receives the different Vaishnav mantras, and Tapa promises to follow the regular principles. And this way there's 5 Panchashanskar aspects of Diksha are very important. And Rupa Goswami is recommending that we go through these. We accept the name from a spiritual master. We take the vows, the tapa. We wear the tilak, and we chant the mantra, the silent mantra, along with the Gayatri, the other Krishna mantras that we're given at the time, the Diksha initiation. And of course, one requires a living Diksha Guru, as according to the Vaishnava Tantras, in order to accept the Vaishnava mantra from the lips of the living Diksha Guru. He will also give shiksha, and in this way, Diksha is very important. But Guru Padasraya, one should serve the spiritual master. Guru and Sadhu Marga Anugaman, one should follow in the footsteps of the saintly persons. Prabhupada discusses how Buddhism was a deviation from the standard Vedic conclusions. Sat Dharma Pritcha, one should inquire about eternal religious principles. Residing in a sacred place, accepting only what is necessary. Prabhupada comments that one shouldn't accept the rulings of devotional service which are more than what he can easily perform. So we recommend our disciples chant at least 16 rounds on their japa, and this should be completed. So it's better to accept a vow which one is practically going to be able to maintain, and not try to follow a standard which is beyond one's capacity. Prabhupada says it's better to fix up a regulated principle according to his own ability and then follow that without fail. That will make him advanced in spiritual life. And that's Prabhupada's comment on accepting only what is necessary. Ekadashi Upavash, Prabhupada explains the real reason for observing fasting on Ekadasi is to maintain the demands of the body, is to minimize the demands of the body, and to engage our time in the service of the Lord by chanting or performing similar service. The best thing to do on fasting days is to remember the pastimes of Govinda and hear his holy name constantly. Today's Ekadasi. Today's Ekadasi. Madhav Titi Bhakti Janani Jatane Palana Kori. Thakur Bhaktivinoda sings that Madhav Titi, the holy days like Ekadasi, Bhakti Janani, they're the mother of devotion. Jatane Palana Kori, for those who properly maintain them. And Prabhupada mentioning here they should be maintained by minimizing the demands of the body and increasing the hearing and chanting. And this is a very important, actually, item. Out of 64, this is categorized in the first 10. First 10. And Prabhupada mentions that these first 10 are very important. So, always we should remember to be careful of properly observing the Ekadasi, Upavash. Respecting the holy trees, Amalaki, banyan trees, and cows and Brahmins, by offering them respect. It's explained how one can show respect to a cow. One can show respect to a cow according to the Vedic system by scratching the cow on the body and giving the cow a handful of grass to eat and circumambulating the cow, keeping your right side to the cow. This is how you respect a cow. Now, giving up the company of non-devotees. These are now we're entering into the first. The first were the first 10 poverty items that should be performed: observing fasting on Ekadasi, accepting only what is necessary, reside in a sacred place, give up everything for Krishna. Saddhamma Pritcha, inquire. Guru Padasraya, take shelter of the spiritual master. Dikha, Sadhu Marga Anugaman, follow the saintly persons. These are the 10 items that should be followed. Worship the sacred trees and the cows. And now the activities that should be rejected, can't give up the company of non-devotees. Prabhupada is describing Mahaprabhu's description of two kinds of non-devotees. Asatsanga Tyagi Vaishnava Achar, Sri Shangi Ek Asat Krishna Bhakta Ar. So the two types of two kinds of non-devotees. Sri Shangi Ek Ashat, one type is one who's too attached to sex life, and Krishna Bhakta are, and the other are the atheists. One class is against the supremacy of Krishna, the other class is too materialistic. So these types of very attached materialistic people, and the materialistic enjoyers, and the atheists, those are atheistic, their association should be given up. Even actually later in the discussion, Prabhupada also mentions about associating with demigod worshippers that are also considered to give up that association. Not something that we particularly associating with demigod worshippers, not something that we particularly cultivate, but on occasion, particularly due to preaching, on occasion we may have to do that. So for preaching we do that. But in general, regarding association, Prabhupada's quoting that even if one is forced, he's quoting from the Katyayani Samhita, actually these references are given in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu by Srila Rupa Goswami, and here Srila Prabhupada is paraphrasing and referencing them for our benefit. Even if one is forced to live within a cage of iron, or in the midst of a blazing fire, he should accept this position rather than live with non-devotees who are through and through against the supremacy of the Lord. Similarly, in the Vishnu Rahasya, there is a statement to the effect that one should prefer to embrace a snake, a tiger, or an alligator, rather than associate with persons who are worshippers of various demigods and who are impelled by material desires. And also the Mayavadis, we should not associate with them, give up their association. In the Vishnu Rahasya, these demigod worshippers are forcefully condemned by the statement that it's better to live with the most dangerous animals than to associate with these persons. So, in general, one should avoid the association of non-devotees, and as much as possible. And Rupa Goswami gives very graphic evidences, very strong evidences for the importance of that. Once again, within these first 20 items, these items are particularly important. Bahushishya na koriba, not to accept too many disciples, to build too many temples or read too many books. Regarding reading too many books, Srila Prabhupada mentions that if one very carefully reads Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, teachings of Lord Chaitanya, and this nectar devotion, that will give him sufficient knowledge to understand the science of Krishna consciousness. Actually, one time when Tapan Mishra Das met Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the banks of Padmavati River in East Bengal, when Mahaprabhu went there for teaching, Tapan Mishra was confused. And at that time, Sriman Mahaprabhu mentioned that Bahu Shastra, Bahu Granta Chitta Brahma Hoy. If we read too many Shastras and too many Granta, too many books, Chitta Brahma Hoy. One becomes confused in the heart. Shadha Nishchoy Siddhanta Na Hoy. And the clear conclusion of sadhana practice and the goal of sadhana will not become apparent to one who reads too many books. And in this way, Mahaprabhu advised Tapan Mishra to simply chant Hare Krishna and go to Varanasi, where Mahaprabhu explained everything to him later when he visited. And so one not need take the trouble of reading other books. Regarding Bahu Shishya na Koriba, not to accept too many disciples, Prabhupada comments that in the line of Lord Chaitanya, even the sannyasis can speak about Krishna consciousness everywhere. If someone is seriously inclined to become a disciple, the sannyasi always accepts him. Therefore, sometimes so the principle Prabhupada mentions here for preaching Krishna consciousness is that anyone that's serious, Prabhupada said, and willing to follow the principles, then the sannyasi will accept that person. But in general, the preacher shouldn't be aspiring to amass huge amounts of followers. Prabhupada mentions that if one increases the number of disciples simply for some prestige or false honor, he will surely fall down in the matter of executing Krishna consciousness. Regarding the demigods, one should not neglect to offer respect to the demigods. One may not be a devotee of the demigods, but one does not mean that he should be disrespectful for them. We saw when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was touring Dakhin Bharat, his South Indian tour. Then Mahaprabhu, he visited the temples of Lord Hari, and he visited the temples of Mahadev, Lord Shiva, and he visited the temples of Ambika Ma there as he was touring South India, and in all of the temples he showed respect to the Vaishnavis and performed Sankirtan. And similarly we can visit the temples of the great Vaishnavis like Lord Shiva and Ma Bhairavi. We can visit these temples, and especially if it's conducive for our preaching, we can distribute books and do Sankirtan at these places and show respect because they're great. We bow down to the demigods because they're great Vaishnavis, just like we would bow down to one spiritual master. So they're on the level of Guru. According to Vaishnava philosophy, one should offer respect even to an ant. Pranimatra manodbhakye udvegana diva, not to give pain to any living entity. A person who does not disturb or cause painful action in the mind of any living entity, who treats everyone just like a loving father treats his children, whose heart is so pure, certainly very soon becomes favoured by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's from the Mahabharata. So in this way, Srila Prabhupada gives an elaborate presentation with detailed information on the significance of and the general application of these first 20 items of the 64 items of Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti. Another point we can discuss, which was mentioned by Srila Prabhupada in the beginning of chapter 6, how to discharge devotional service, was the general issue regarding principles and details. So let's read what Srila Prabhupada comments there. The purport of this statement is that Srila Rupa Goswami proposes to mention only basic principles, not details. For example, a basic principle is that one has to accept a spiritual master. Exactly how one follows the instruction of his spiritual master is considered a detail. So as followers of Srila Prabhupada and as disciples of Srila Prabhupada's followers, we need to be clear on the distinction between a principle and a detail. So what are the principles and what are the details? Well, the principles are these 64 items that Srila Rupa Goswami is mentioning here. That's why he's clarifying, and that's what Srila Prabhupada is explaining here, that Srila Prabhupada says that the basic principle of accepting a spiritual master is good everywhere, although the details may be different. Srila Rupa Goswami does not wish to enter into details, but wants to place before us only the principle. So the principle is that Guru Padasraya, one has to be sheltered at the lotus feet of the spiritual master. Now the nature of that shelter, the nature will differ from disciple to disciple, and it's not that we have to expect everyone to be sheltered in the same way. Not that we expect everyone to be following the instructions and to be instructed in the same way, but the principle of Guru Seva and Guru Padasraya, Diksha, Guru Seva, Guru Satdharma Pritcha, inquiring and hearing the types of questions that are inquired by the disciple and the types of details, the types of answers, and the types of seva that the spiritual master gives to the disciple will differ. So we need to understand that as we're expanding the Krishna consciousness movement and we're educating newcomers to the principles of Krishna consciousness, then we have to understand that they have their individual approach to following these 64 items, and we should be able to encourage them to have an individual approach as long as they're following these items that Srila Rupa Goswami mentions. How they do that will vary from follower to follower. And that's accepted because the details, as Prabhupada mentions here, we do not want to enter the details. And then even particularly, we'll see that Rupa Goswami, to facilitate even further, simplify for the follower, he's not going into details, he's just giving the principles. So then the way in which these principles are followed will vary according to convenience, and that's acceptable. And also he, at the end of the Choishati Sadhananga, explaining 64 items, again he reiterates Panchanga Sadhan Bhakti, that these 5 items which are particularly important, Sakal Sadhan Shreshta Epachanga, these 5 items, Krishna Prema Janma Epacha Alpashanga, are very powerful, and they can very quickly awaken the goal of love of Godhead. So you can see that the Vaidhi Sadhana package is very elaborate, and at the same time there is a very strong element there of liberality according to the convenience of the practitioner. That the details are not considered, it's just the general principles Rupa Goswami gives, and also if one can't practice all of the 64 items, then Rupa Goswami mentions 5 particularly that particularly should be followed. So in this way we can see the facility that Rupa Goswami gives is very convenient for practicing particularly those who are in the Sankirtan movement of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and in all sorts of situations and all types of lifestyles can still very conveniently, in an authorized way, as a authentic Rupanuga, can practice Vaidhi Sadhana Bhakti, because it accommodates the various circumstances that we find ourselves in. Item number 18 of the 64 items, which also appeared within the first 20 most important items, was to avoid the offences in deity worship. Item number 18, which appeared in the first 20, which are the most important items. Sevanam aparad adi dure bisharjan. The seva aparad means the offences in deity worship, and nam aparad, offences in chanting. Dure, we should keep at a distance, and bisharjan, we should give these up. In Srila Prabhupada's chapter 8 of the Nectar Devotion, he's a whole chapter entitled Offences to be Avoided, and in this entire chapter Prabhupada has listed offences from the different Vedic literatures that Rupa Goswami had compiled. This is Rupa Goswami has compiled these, and Srila Prabhupada is enumerating them in his commentary. 32 Seva Aparads from the supplementary Vedic literatures, 29 from the Baraha Purana, and 8 Seva Aparads to be avoided from the other rules and regulations, and 10 Nama Aparads, which are listed in the Padma Purana, and we usually have the lecture on the 10 offences in the chanting of the holy name at the time of initiation. So some of these offences are all very important and should be avoided. Some of them to note that we can discuss briefly. Prabhupada discusses in detail all of them, and some of them are very interesting, that we should not fail to observe the various festivals for the pleasure of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So that's an important item of sadhana, that regardless of the circumstances one may find oneself in. Of course, if one is in a temple or a community of Vaishnavas, then naturally all of the festivals will be celebrated in as grand a manner as possible. But even if one finds oneself in a situation where he's not in a community of devotees due to various professional reasons or other circumstances, health circumstances, still one can, as best according to one's means, but one should observe the festival, the fasting, etc., the hearing, that should all go on the festival titis, like Janmashtami, etc., Prabhupada says, and Ratha Yatra. Of course, Ratha Yatra is a major festival, and one would attend that, and one would attend, actually, Ratha Yatra would mean that one would go somewhere where the Rath was being pulled. So that should also be participated in. One should not avoid bowing down before the deity. Sometimes we may kind of skip that. So one should not avoid bowing down before the deity, especially at home. So there you go. One should not talk with others before the deity. That sometimes happens in ISKCON when we're at the temple and people come and talk to you. So better not to do that in front of the deity. Better to do that outside the temple. One shouldn't chastise anyone before the deity. One shouldn't speak very harshly before the deity. Number 28, one shouldn't sit with his back toward the deity. One shouldn't offer obeisances silently to the spiritual master. but they should be allowed, at least uttered softly. One shouldn't fail to offer some praise in the presence of the spiritual master. In the case if one can't think of what to say or one feels a little awkward, one can simply chant the standard glorification of Acharyas in the Gaudiya line. Jayam Shripad Paribrajak Acharya Sri Shrimad Shula Acharya Goshai Maharaj Ki Jai. And in that way one can glorify the spiritual master. One shouldn't praise himself before the spiritual master. So then from the supplementary Vedic literature, from the Varaha Purana, some interesting points. One shouldn't enter the temple without first making some sound. So for that reason you'll find a bell in the front of the temple. So you can ring the bell before you enter the deity room, before you enter the temple. One shouldn't offer, this is number 7, one should not offer incense without offering some flour. So, have the flowers ready. When you offer incense, offer flour. Don't neglect that. One shouldn't use useless flowers without any fragrance. Don't offer a flower which was kept in an unclean pot. Don't sit on the bare floor when worshipping the deity. Regarding the worship of Ganapati, Rupa Goswami mentions the worship of Ganapati. We worship Ganapati when we worship Lord Narasimhadev. Yat pada pallavaplavam vinadhaya kumbhatande pranama shamaya shaganadi rajaha. Because he's holding the lotus feet of Lord Narasimhadev on his head, and in that way he's being empowered to remove the obstacles of the worshipper. So usually Ganesh is worshipped to remove the obstacles of the worship. But by worshipping Lord Narasimhadev, then all the obstacles of the devotee are removed. Sarva Vigna Vinash Narasimha Bhagavan. And in that way, it's not required for us to worship Ganapati. Some devotees did write to Srila Prabhupada requesting permission to worship Ganapati, and Prabhupada gave his permission on the one condition. He said that you can worship Ganesh Ji. If you can see the letter, it's actually in our student materials, that you can worship Ganesh Ji, but you have to provide every month to me $100,000 and not a penny less. So that's the condition for worshipping Ganesh, according to Prabhupada's standard. Avoiding these various offences is very important, because by avoiding these offences and by being cautious to make sure that we avoid the offences, we in that way we're able to maintain the attitude of reverence and seriousness which is required for the practice of the deity worship, as Srila Prabhupada mentions. Our duty is that we should never think of this deity as something made of stone or metal. We should always think, here is Krishna personally present. That is devotion. And we should worship him like that. We should offer respect that here is Krishna, we cannot do anything wrong. And therefore there is a list of offences in the Nectar Devotion. Do you discuss this? So we should avoid these offences. Not that here is a stone statue, he's not going to see I am doing this offence. Then this is not very good. We should always feel that here is Krishna personally present. So yes, Srila Prabhupada, to some degree, we are discussing these offences in the Nectar Devotion. And yes, Prabhupada is emphasising that this is very important. Because by carefully ensuring that we carefully avoid all of these offences, then we will keep our mentality very reverential and very attentive to the fact that we are dealing with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in that way, the archana sadhana practice will contribute in a very powerful way to the awakening of our love of Godhead. Okay? I'm going to edit out all of that, and here we're carrying on. Regarding offending the Supreme Personality of Godhead and committing these offences in the worship of the Lord, toward the end of his discussion on this section, top of page 72 in this edition, Srila Prabhupada comments that when a person becomes an offender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he can still be delivered simply by taking shelter of the holy name of the Lord. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Now this is confirmed by Narottam Das Thakur, that Harishtane aparade tare harinam. That even if Harishtan aparade, even if a person is situated in an offensive manner, they're offending the Harishtan aparade tare, the means of deliverance is harinam. That chanting of the holy name can actually deliver you from the offences in the deity worship, the Seva aparad. So all of these offences that we heard listed, chanting Hare Krishna will purify us of reactions that we may incur as a result of neglecting to avoid these offences. So we have to be very careful to do that. But in any case, if not that we're willingly, but if out of some negligence we're committing some offence, that can be neutralized by chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. However, Prabhupada continues that, in other words, the chanting of Hare Krishna is beneficial for eradicating all sins. But if one becomes an offender to the holy name of the Lord, he has no chance to be delivered. So one has to avoid, there's no way of being delivered, no way of avoiding the reactions that incur to one who is offending the holy name by neglecting to avoid the offences in the chanting of the holy name, Namaparaj. So those 10 offences are there, and we chant them every morning, and we should be very careful to avoid the Namaparaj, 10 offences in chanting the holy name, so that very quickly we can progress in our practice of sadhana bhakti. Let's conclude this chapter with Srila Prabhupada's comments. You must see that they strictly follow the regulated principles, the 4 prohibitions, as well as the devotional practices of rising early, taking morning bath, putting on tilak, attending Mangaladi, chanting 16 rounds, and attending Srimad Bhagavatam class. This is the duty of all my initiated disciples, whether they are big, whether they are small. Actually, in our movement, there is no such thing as big or small. Everyone is a devotee, so everyone is expected to follow the devotional practices. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.